The Galactic Council's decision. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council shimmered under the artificial glow of astral crystals embedded in its domed ceiling. Representatives from the 57-member worlds filled the amphitheater, their voices weaving a tapestry of discord. At the center of it all stood High Arbiter Nissa Callan, her emerald cloak pooling around her feet like liquid authority. She rapped her staff of office against the floor, its resonant chime silencing the assembly. Order! Nissa's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The council will now address the matter of the Elgin Accord. The Elgin Accord had been a fragile promise, a century-old pact that bound the member worlds to mutual aid in times of crisis. But now, with the Reverend Dominion's encroachments threatening the borders of the outer systems, that promise had begun to fray. Nissa's sharp gaze swept the room. Ambassador Tarvek of Halos Prime, you have the floor. A wiry man with silvered hair rose from his seat, his posture exuding both weariness and defiance. The Dominion has already annexed 3 independent sectors, Tarvek began, his voice carrying a faint tremor. Their warships lurk within striking distance of our trade routes. And yet, this council debates endlessly while our people bleed. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Across the room, Lady Kiravalin of Ashta leaned forward, her jeweled headdress catching the light. "And what do you propose, Ambassador?" she asked, her tone sharp. "That we rush headlong into war without strategy or unity. That would spell the end of us all." Tarvek's jaw tightened. "Unity won't matter if there's no one left to defend." Nissa raised her hand, silencing the exchange. "Ambassador Tarvek, your concerns are noted. But this council must consider all options before committing to action. We are not merely defending Halos Prime. We are safeguarding the stability of the entire galaxy." As the debate resumed, a shadowed figure leaned against the far wall, observing the proceedings with a calculating eye. Saran Kale, a former Dominion officer turned renegade, had been summoned as a reluctant advisor to the council. His presence was controversial, his insights invaluable. Saran's lips curled into a faint smirk as he watched the delegates argue. He leaned closer to the young envoy beside him, a wide-eyed novice named Lyra. "They're all so busy posturing," he murmured. "They can't see the storm bearing down on them." Lyra frowned. "You think the Dominion will strike soon?" Saran's eyes darkened. "It's not a question of if, but when. And when they do, it won't be on the council's terms." At the center of the chamber, Nissa's voice rose again. "Saran Kale, step forward." The hall fell silent as Saran pushed away from the wall, his boots echoing on the polished floor. His dark attire contrasted sharply with the council's opulence, a reminder of the worlds he had left behind and the ones he had betrayed. "You've warned us of the Dominion's tactics," Nissa began, her tone measured. "But we need more than warnings. What would you have us do?" Saran inclined his head, his gaze sweeping the room. "The Dominion thrives on fear and division. They exploit hesitation. If the council waits, they'll pick your worlds apart one by one. You need to act decisively, strike where they're weakest, disrupt their supply chains, undermine their alliances, and risk provoking an all-out war." Lady Valen interjected, her voice sharp. Saran met her gaze, unflinching. "War is already upon you, my lady. Pretending otherwise won't change that." The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices. Nissa let them argue for a moment before rapping her staff again. "Enough!" She turned back to Saran. "And if the council chooses inaction?" Saran's smirk returned, cold and knowing. "Then you'd better start negotiating your surrender." The bluntness of his words sent a ripple of unease through the room. Even Nissa, unshakable in her authority, felt a flicker of doubt. Before she could respond, a chime echoed through the chamber. A holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the room, a priority transmission from the outer sectors. A grim-faced officer appeared, his uniform singed and his voice strained. "This is Captain Ryan of the Sentinel Fleet," he began. "The Dominion has launched a full-scale assault on the Valiant system. We're outnumbered and outgunned, requesting immediate assistance." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Nissa's knuckles whitened around her staff. "You've all heard it," she said, her voice hard. The time for debate is over. We must act. Ambassador Tarvek stood again, his voice steadier now. Then let Halos Prime lead the charge. Our fleets will not stand idle while our allies fall. Lady Valen hesitated, then rose as well. Ashta will lend its forces. But we need a coordinated strategy, one that ensures our survival. Nissa turned to Saran. You've faced the Dominion firsthand. Will you help us? Saran's smirk faded, replaced by a rare seriousness. If it means putting an end to their tyranny, I'll do whatever it takes. The High Arbiter nodded, her decision made. Then it is settled. The Council will mobilize. Together, we will defend the galaxy. As the assembly broke into action, Nissa allowed herself a moment to reflect. The road ahead would be perilous, fraught with sacrifice. But for the first time in years, the Council was united, if only against a common enemy. And in the shadows of the Great Hall, Saran Kale allowed himself a fleeting smile. The game had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. The Bartender versus the army. The village of Calithra had never seen war, yet its people lived with the quiet caution of those who feared its arrival. Nestled between jagged cliffs and dense forests, the settlement thrived in isolation, its only link to the outside world being the travelers who passed through. Among them was Damon Voss, a bartender whose enigmatic presence belied the storm he carried within. Damon had been in Calithra for 5 years. No one knew where he came from, and no one dared ask. His bar, the Iron Flask, was a refuge, a dimly lit haven where the air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey and burning cedar. Damon spoke little, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, though his hands, when pouring a drink or slicing a lemon, were almost tender. The army arrived on a windless evening, their boots striking the cobblestones like the beating of war drums. 50 men strong, clad in dull steel and bearing the sigil of the Empire, a coiled serpent. At their helm was Captain Alaric Dorn, a man whose reputation for brutality had preceded him. They marched into Calithra with a singular purpose: to extract a tribute of men and resources for the Empire's ceaseless conquests. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces pale under the flickering light of torches. Alaric's voice was cold and steady as he listed their demands. 24 men for the front lines, 3 months' worth of provisions, and every ounce of gold the village could spare. Resistance, he warned, would be met with fire and steel. Damon watched from the shadows of his bar, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. He had seen this before, in other towns, under other banners. He knew how it would play out. The villagers would protest, plead, and bargain. The army would take what it wanted, leaving behind shattered lives and empty homes. But something about Calithra was different. These people weren't warriors, but they weren't cowards either. When the village elder, a stooped woman named Lyra, stepped forward to argue with Alaric, the captain struck her down with the back of his gauntlet. The crowd erupted in cries of outrage, and Damon felt the familiar stirrings of a long-buried instinct. He downed the whiskey in one gulp, the liquid burning its way down his throat, and stepped into the square. "You've made your point, Captain," Damon said, his voice low but carrying. The crowd turned toward him, parting instinctively as he approached. Alaric regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "And who might you be?" the captain asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Just a bartender," Damon replied. "But I have a proposal." The soldiers chuckled, but Alaric silenced them with a raised hand. "Go on. You take your tribute and leave the village in peace," Damon said. "But you leave the men behind. I'll give you what you really want." "And what's that?" Alaric asked, his tone mocking. Damon's lips curved into a humorless smile. "A fight." The square fell silent. Damon's words hung in the air, daring the captain to respond. Alaric's eyes narrowed, assessing the man before him. There was something about Damon, something coiled and dangerous, like a blade hidden in the folds of a cloak. "You think you can take on 50 men?" Alaric said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Not 50, Damon said. "Just you?" The crowd gasped. A challenge. One man against the captain of the Empire's elite forces. It was madness. Yet there was something in Damon's demeanor that made it seem almost plausible. Alaric laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're either very brave or very stupid, bartender." "Let's find out," Damon said. The duel was set for dawn, just outside the village, on a barren stretch of land where the cliffs met the forest. Word spread quickly, and by morning, the entire village had gathered to watch. The soldiers stood in a loose formation, their armor gleaming in the pale light. Alaric stood at their center, his sword drawn and his expression grim. Damon arrived alone, his only weapon a weathered quarterstaff. The villagers whispered among themselves, questioning his choice. A staff against a sword? It seemed suicidal. But Damon walked with the confidence of a man who had already won. The two men faced each other, the tension palpable. Alaric lunged first, his blade a silver blur. Damon sidestepped with ease, his staff whipping around to deflect the strike. The clash of wood against steel echoed across the clearing. Alaric attacked again, faster this time, his movements precise and deadly. But Damon was faster. He moved like water, flowing around the captain's strikes and countering with measured blows of his own. His staff struck Alaric's wrist, his knee, his ribs. The captain stumbled back, his breathing labored. "You fight well," Alaric admitted, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. "But this ends now." He charged, his sword aimed for Damon's heart. For a moment, it seemed as though the bartender would finally falter. But Damon pivoted at the last second, his staff striking Alaric's hand with a sickening crack. The sword flew from the captain's grip, landing in the dirt several feet away. Damon leveled his staff at Alaric's throat. "Yield." The captain hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally he nodded. "I yield." A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by a roar of approval. The villagers surged forward, their fear replaced by newfound hope. The soldiers, seeing their leader defeated, began to retreat, carrying Alaric with them. As the army disappeared into the horizon, Damon turned to the villagers. They looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe, but he held up a hand to silence their praise. "This isn't over," he said, his voice grave. "They'll be back, and they won't come alone." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes filled with determination. "Then we'll be ready." Damon nodded, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. Calithro wasn't just a village, it was a spark, and he would make sure it didn't go out. The bartender turned to the villagers, knowing the battle had only just begun. Humanity's response and the council defeat. The council ship hung in orbit over the smoldering remains of Tokyo. Its sleek hull gleamed like an unbroken blade, reflecting the fiery chaos below. Inside, Supreme Chancellor Edrax paced the bridge, his clawed hands clasped behind his back. His reptilian eyes flickered with cold amusement as he observed the Earth's fragmented resistance on a holographic display. Humanity's stubbornness is as predictable as their technology is primitive, he hissed, turning toward his second-in-command, Commander HFY. A futile gesture, no matter how tenacious. HFY hesitated, his scaled brow furrowed. "Supreme Chancellor, reports indicate anomalies in their countermeasures. Small teams of operatives are bypassing our defenses, targeting critical infrastructure aboard our ships." Edrax snarled, baring sharp, serrated teeth. "Saboteurs? On my fleet? Incompetence!" Meanwhile, on the planet's surface, Captain Elise Moreau crouched behind a crumbling wall, her pulse rifle pressed tightly to her chest. Her squad, a patchwork of Earth's finest, reluctant alliance of soldiers, hackers, and engineers, waited for her signal. The air reeked of charred metal and ozone from the Council's orbital strikes. "Captain," whispered Priya, a wiry engineer who had been working on a makeshift EMP device. "The jammer's almost ready, but we need another 5 minutes." Elise nodded grimly. "You've got 2. The Council's drones will spot us if we linger." Across from her, Elias Zhang, the team's sharp-eyed sniper, scanned the skies with his scope. No sign of reinforcements, but they're sending recon patrols. "We're running out of time." Elise didn't need reminding. Every second spent on the ground was borrowed time. She pressed her earpiece. Command, this is Ghost Team. EMP device nearing completion. Awaiting orbital coordinates for activation. Static crackled before a calm, measured voice responded. Acknowledge, Ghost Team. Coordinates coming through. Expect heavy resistance. Elise smirked. Wouldn't want it any other way. Up above, aboard the Council flagship, Ticharwanin's claws danced across the console. Supreme Chancellor, unauthorized signals are disrupting our communication network. It originates from multiple locations on the surface. Edrax's nostrils flared. They're trying to blind us. Dispatch more drones. Find their operatives and eliminate them. I will not tolerate insubordination from an inferior species. Ticharwanin hesitated. There's another complication. Long-range scanners detected a fleet of unknown vessels approaching from the outer system. Their configurations don't match any known human designs. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed Edrax's face. Show me. The holographic display shifted, revealing a cluster of ships hurtling toward Earth. Their angular forms exuded an alien menace, their energy signatures unfamiliar even to the Council's advanced sensors. Impossible, Edrax muttered. No other species in this sector possesses faster-than-light travel. Back on the surface, Priya's voice broke through Elise's focus. Done. The jammer's ready. Elias, cover us, Elise ordered as Priya and two others hurried to activate the device. She raised her rifle, firing controlled bursts at the approaching drones. Her squad moved as one, their cohesion forged through months of relentless skirmishes. Every shot counted, every second mattered. The EMP device pulsed to life, releasing an invisible wave that crackled through the air. Above, Council drones dropped from the sky like broken toys. Elise allowed herself a grim smile. Command, this is Ghost Team. Device activated. Proceeding to extraction. Before Command could respond, a deafening roar tore through the atmosphere. Elise and her team turned skyward to witness an awe-inspiring sight. The alien fleet had arrived, its ships engaging the Council in a brutal, chaotic melee. What the hell is that? Elias breathed, lowering his rifle. Elise didn't answer. The alien vessels, unlike anything humanity had ever seen, unleashed torrents of energy that tore through the Council's formation. The flagship's shields flickered, struggling to absorb the onslaught. On the Council bridge, Edrax slammed his fists against the console. Who are they? His voice dripped with fury and desperation. Ticharwanin, shaken but efficient, analyzed the incoming data. Their technology is superior. They've disabled our primary weapons. Our fleet is collapsing. Edrax turned toward the viewport, his eyes narrowing. Humanity has allies. They hid this from us. Supreme Chancellor. Ticharwanin began, but Edrax cut him off with a snarl. We will not be undone by primitives and their unknown benefactors. Order all remaining ships to target the lead vessel. If we fall, we take them with us. Back on the ground, Elise's earpiece buzzed with new orders. Captain, the Council's fleet is retreating, but the situation is unclear. The unidentified vessels are targeting both Council ships and orbital defense platforms. Evacuate immediately. Elise, Priya said urgently, we can't fight those things. We need to move now. Elise's jaw tightened. Understood. Ghost Team, fall back to the rendezvous point. As they moved, the ground shook violently, debris raining from the sky. The alien fleet's bombardment was indiscriminate, obliterating Council and human installations alike. Elise couldn't shake the feeling that humanity had traded one enemy for another. Aboard the Council flagship, chaos reigned. Ticharwanin shouted orders, trying to stabilize the ship as it spiraled toward Earth's atmosphere. Edrax, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of panic, stared at the alien fleet with unmasked hatred. This isn't over, he muttered, gripping the edges of his throne. Not by a long shot. As the flagship broke apart, a single escape pod ejected from its hull, disappearing into the planet's cloud cover. On the surface, Elise and her team reached their extraction point, where a battered shuttle waited. As they boarded, She cast one last glance at the sky. The Council's dominance was shattered, but the cost of their reprieve was steep, and the nature of their new visitors remained a mystery. "Captain," Command's voice came through again, strained but resolute. "Mission accomplished. Regroup at Base Echo for debriefing." Elise nodded, her resolve hardening. "Copy that. But this isn't over." The shuttle lifted off, leaving behind a scarred battlefield and a fractured world. Humanity had won a battle, but the war was far from finished. Above them, the alien fleet loomed, a harbinger of new challenges, new alliances, and new betrayals. And in the ruins of the Council flagship, a lone escape pod nestled into the Earth, carrying with it a dangerous secret that could shift the balance of power once more.